Hello, everyone. My name is Yahia Zhengtang. I'm from the Baer Institute of University of Melbourne, Australia. Today, I'm going to talk about the topic queer as a verb, new approaches to queer literal translation. This paper unpacks the three layers of what queer as a verb means in the context of literal translation, which includes to do translation as a queer praxis, to fuck binaries, excuse language, and to incorporate queer theory to translation and translation studies. Before I get started, I have to say that please accept my apologies that today I will not include the textual analysis examples from the mainland Chinese writer Wang Xiaobo's sentiments like water, as you have seen in the abstract. So that means I will have to include the examples from the Taiwanese author Ta-wei's short stories and another book written in 1994, which is called Notes of a Desolate Man. Researchers of translation and sexuality have increasingly problematized queer translation in the past 10 years, even though a wave of scholarship focusing on queer and queer translation actually contributed to how we practice queer translation. The field exposes an enormous gap between queer translation and translation from and into Chinese language. So that means the translation of normative sexualities, genders, and desires in the Chinese context has been under-researched and understudied and underrepresented. Notable exceptions, however, as you can see, include works by Andrea Bucknell, Liu Chen, Douglas Robinson, among others. So when translating text from non-Anglophone and non-Western context, William J. Spurlin asks how to work with the specificity of the term queer. This serves as the beginning point for me to explore the gender and sexual politics of translation in the Chinese context. If the word queer is significant both in its representation of a celebration of difference and the reappropriation of the language used by the heterosexist culture, then the meaning that a queer acquires in its translation into non-English cultural and linguistic codes are more significant, as the study of queer goes beyond a universal notion of fixed identity and a default category. That being said, queerness as a concept or a cultural reference connects with a key issue in contemporary translation studies to the extent that translation is not merely about languages alone. Conceptions of translation are always aligned with an understanding of language. However, translation is not a mere linguistic process, but intimately intertwined with new forms of textual and cultural production. If translation can lead to revitalizing culture or active force that continually introduces new ideas, new forms, and/or new expressions and pathways for change, translation can be a site of correspondence on which cultural systems, linguistic domains, and social norms regarding gender, sexuality, and sexual freedom are communicated, translated, and remembered. At the core of translation is this intersectional and transformational nucleus where languages touch, to use Emily Apter's words. This encounter suggests an epistemological cause or an attention that enables us to pay attention to different meanings and points of view. Analyzing sexual and gender differences in translation can, as Spurlin argues, stimulate significant shifts in social identities and categories. While considering the nuanced ways in which gender and sexuality are inscribed in languages, and questioning if the very terms used for gender and sexual identities reduce to equivalence, attention on these transgressions, slippages of signification and difference is a comparatively queer praxis. To give an example, in my researching of the 1990s Chinese language, Tongzhi, and queer literature, I have been so struck by how challenges representation of same-sex desire through troubling traditional gender roles and heteronormative sexuality. In Taiwan, for example, the last decade of the 20th century witnessed the phase in which globalization and localization are intricately bound together, especially concerning gender and sexuality. Looking back at the 90s, I should have to acknowledge that the term 同志, comrade, is the most popular contemporary Chinese word for lesbians, bisexuals, and gay people. 同志, which has its own historical references such as the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, was an indirect translation from Russian, French, and English by Chinese and Japanese scholars, which denotes the revolutionaries who shared common aims and wills. These reimagined terms are a result of modern Chinese men's quest for the political alliance, marked the outset of the totalizing politicalization of the construction of masculinity at a national level. As argued by Ta-wei Chi, 同志 are the most creative invention of modern Chinese language in the 90s. The once reclusive phrase has been painted lavender purple. Here, rather than recounting the extensive scholarly achievements on the term, I would argue instead that appropriation of the term 同志 by LGBT+ communities in Taiwan, mainland China, and Hong Kong symbolizes an inseparability in the imagination of belonging to community and originality. With the rise of 同志 and queer movements in Taiwan, expressions of non-normative desires and sexualities proliferated since 1990s. I find fetishism particularly as a point of entry into a discussion of queer translation as the central concern of fetishism and queer translation is to challenge the universalizing pretensions of dominant models of practices and notions of sexuality, desire, and pleasure. Many of the Taiwan author Ta-wei's texts use fetishism to create representations of same-sex desire through challenging traditional gender roles and heteronormative sexuality. In one of his short stories called 香皂 soap, it's translated as the scent of HIV by Martin. The protagonist is aroused by the rose-scented sweaty smell of the male body, which is affected by HIV and AIDS. Olfactory failure, both in the original writing and the translation, is manifested through the atmosphere of the swimming pool, the men's change room, and the swimming strokes and the styles. In the context of the entrenched homophobia and HIV/AIDS phobia in Taiwan in the 90s, Ta-wei's short story embraces fetishism as a site of embodied queer praxis. Martin's translation of the title as The Scent of HIV, other than its literal translation, soap, modeled on her own field research in Taiwan in mid and late 90s, highlights her translation pays attention to gender and sexual difference, and traverses literary and psychoanalytical boundaries and established forms of erotic fantasy and carnal desire. The translation acknowledges the disruptive forces and expose that in the target language, suggesting what Mark Damon would call most of current translation as opposed to misrecognizing and minoritizing modes. Here is an example that shows a specific manifestation of fetishism. It is an instance of sexualized phrases that are colloquial and sensitive in the Chinese language, and thus complicated when it comes to translation. The Chinese phrase 射出来, meaning shooting out, suggests a volume of semen and the force and distance of ejaculation. This is evident in the author's metaphorical use of the stream of water shooting out of the shower head for the force of ejaculation. It is underpinned by the head that is massaging the man's body in the steamy shower room full of other male bodies. Martin's translation invites the potential for queer reading that can challenge the imposition of an established sexual epistemology and embraces queer texts like the center of HIV as a site of embodied queer performance to disrupt heteronormativity and penetration-based normative sex in the bedroom. Martin also recreates queerness in the translation of the text saturated by cruisy undertones by introducing another queer dimension, a possible relationship between a puppy and a handler in the BDSM world. Martin uses a pair of terms, puppy and master, that is frequently articulated in the BDSM community within a dom and sub context. Translation also at the same time implies that analyses of gender and sexual preference intersect. As Santamalia argues, translating sex and sexuality is a political act that registers translators' attitude toward existing conceptualizations of gender and sexual identities, human sexual behaviors, and moral norms. Translation of same-sex desire can reveal the most intimate textualizations of our identities and desires for queer translation. As we know, in translation studies, the normative binary is always a source type equivalence. The problem of equivalence lies in the asymmetrical properties of natural languages by nature, as Brian James Baer argues. The act of translation brings together two words that cannot be the same. One reason is that the foreign words puncture the regime of fluency as they have lived different lives in their respective languages and cultures. The subject of male same-sex desire as a defining linguistic and cultural order of the heterosexual nation has been characterized as foreign. In Chinese language, Tongshi and queer literature, the themes of travel, exile, diaspora, migration are persistent with those who are attracted to people of the same sex, being situated at a considerable geographical distance and living in exile from their homeland. For example, in the Taiwanese author Zhu Tianwen's 1994 novel Huang Renshou, translated as Notes of a Desolate Man by Howard Goldblatt and Sylvia Lee, a classic modernist fiction on homosexuality, traces the desolate man's trans-border travel from Taipei to many places around the globe. The wanderer confesses that I have long been infected by an incurable sense of rootlessness among the in-world. The homosexuals have no nation or homeland. The protagonist's characterization of the in-world in Chinese culture is negative and feminine, as opposed to yang, which is positive, bright, and masculine. It's associated with a lack of homeland, or in Frank Martin's translation, fatherland, or in the words of Goldman, the nationless world. The Chinese phrase for the nation, 祖国, is feminine and so often characterized with the feminine image as evident in the Chinese classic text. Presentations attributed to the yin-yang ideas, formulation, where heaven is father and earth is mother. Martin's use of fatherland without attempting to allegorize of translation by combining of source and tagged based on the point of as an endpoint in cross-cultural exchange. In the set of behaviors and conduct that we refer to as feminine or masculine are not slaves to the biological, the translations also reveal a challenge to traditional binary models of sender and receiver. If the illusion of infidelity in textual communication and sexual intercourse represents the inner nature of what Theodore Adorno would call patriarchal commandment of abstinence, virginity, and chastity. Translation is intrinsic to what heteronormative demands. It lets us imagine communication outside the heteronormative imperative and conceptualize new possibilities that are not dominated by father husbands, disciplined by masters, and penetrated by the phallus. Elena Basile also offers a selective image of the fuck-up translation. She argues that the theory between queer and the translation can be a fuckable one. For her, the queering of translation is based on the fairly perversive heterosexist analogy between sexuality and translation. In the scene of translation, languages touch, pleasure, lubricate, and fuck each other, undoing and repurposing the systems and norms. With this, we can discover that the performing of translation opens up a distinct space of queer performativity for unprecedented possibility for series of queer translation, fucking binaries, source versus target, vagina versus penis, and yin versus yang. Douglas Robinson also notes that the translation studies version of gender fuck would be equivalence fuck. Through his reading of the body bilingual translation as rewriting in the feminine, he reminds us that fuck gender norms is kind of manifesto for radical feminist translation that strategically with equivalence. Dismantling sexual and gender binaries that are structured around fixed stable identities and open new possibilities for cross-identification across the binary positions, including man versus woman, HIV positive versus negative, as argued by Christopher Lacoste, and I would add those regarding non-normative sexual roles, such as puppy versus handler and fister versus tea. So due to the time limit, I will have to give the next example of sadomasochism, and now let's move on to the conclusion. While fucking binaries plays a vital role in critiquing what is fetishized as source-target equivalence, considering translation as a queer praxis, demonstrates that the translated text is a site of supplementarity and difference. Also suggests that the correlation and relevance of translation studies to queer theory opens new approaches to queer translation. Just as queer theory challenges the dominant regimes of knowledge and power as natural and universal, and resists of stability that automatically claims heterosexuality as its origin, to use Anna Maria Jagos's words. Current translation seeks to explore more expansive ways of identities, sexualities, desires, and practices to be imagined. However, one might possibly question whether a generic masculinity may be reinstalled at the heart of the ostensibly gender-neutral queer in this project. I use queer as a verb, its gerund form, ing form in particular, to describe the ways of queer in translation as a doing and performing, where there are lubricating and fucking between textuality and sexuality. Queer translation thus is conducive to countering the ideological penetration of linguistic, cultural, and sexual hegemony, and ultimately situating queer translation in the Chinese context offers opportunities to queer how we think about cultural and linguistic difference, and the minoritarian framing of Chinese language and culture as non-Western or non-Anglophone, or it sometimes just put that into the umbrella term Asian. Even though queer translation in the Chinese context is a potentiality that is always in the horizon, it allows for unveiling the most intimate textualizations of our identities and desires for queer translation. So I will stop here. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting speech and topic. I don't know if any of you have questions or comments. Please, with some time to dedicate to the discussion. This is a very interesting continuation of the previous talk about identity from another point of view, but and ideology also, of course. So please, do you have any questions? Maybe it is interesting to see how translators are also very important for shaping languages and push the boundaries, language boundaries that and make us rethink the languages and this binarism and ideology that is in our languages. Anyway, thank you very much for this food for thought.